Boker Tov, good morning to all of you. I would like, with your permission, not to speak on specific issues regarding the problems of terror, but try to point at some major undercurrents that I believe exist and influence the environment in which we live, creating new problems and challenges for all of us. The most characteristic feature of our time, I think, is the accelerated pace of changes. Major changes happen in our life, in our environment, and they influence the way we live our life in many fields: economy, culture, and in the field of defense, war, security, terror. It is easily said, but it's quite important to note that the problem in times of changes is that people usually find it difficult to grasp in time the change that occurs, to adapt to it, and be ready to cope with it. When one speaks of war, one knows the old maxim that generals know very well to fight the old war. They prepare very well for what they knew to be the war. If the war of tomorrow looks like the war of yesterday, it's okay. So you prepare better, you have better tanks, better planes, better tactics. But if the war of tomorrow is very different from the war that you had practiced yesterday, you may fail. I don't think that this was easy. We know it wasn't for Polish officers in the 30s to understand that the horses are out and tanks are in. They prepared better with the horses for the German army. It, of course, didn't help them much. I think that as a result of a major success of what I may call Western technology in conventional warfare, in many other fields of life, there were two major results. One, success brings about adaptation to the new norms, to new values, to the Western world ideas. The other is that people who don't agree with these values find other ways to fight them, because they couldn't fight them the old ways. That brought some of our neighbors who understood that we are strong enough to survive all attacks on us to go to peace with us. Egypt, Jordan, others a little less formally. But at the same time, there developed another trend of people who maintain the same old goal of getting rid of us, but moving the battlefield to two other layers. One I would call supra-conventional, above conventional. I mean, of course, nuclear. We saw Iraq, Libya, Syria, Iran. And to the sub-conventional, below conventional, to terror and guerrilla. Now, what is new about that? We had terror since day one of human existence. Only in the radically, quickly changing world, the capability of individuals to cause a lot of damage was augmented 1,000 times. Terror could create a lot of trouble even in the old days. 1914, the killing of one man in Sarajevo brought about a world war. But he killed one man. To kill thousands of people in a terror act is something that only the new technology, the new globalized world has brought to us just 9 years ago in New York and Washington. And when one thinks of the capabilities of people to do damage, I think we can use the phrase that President Reagan used to and loved to use: you ain't seen nothing yet. Think of the cyber terror. Think of what groups, individual groups can do. Now, this is a new world. if you are well prepared for the enemies that used to attack you, and what you do is you build more tanks and more planes and more nuclear bombs and more submarines and more missiles, it may not help you to catch bin Laden. It didn't. Because the danger, the challenge is entirely different. So I want to speak on some of those changes that I see happening in our life that call, I think, for our attention and for rethinking the paradigm, rethinking the ways we fight terror, not technically, not in a certain operation, not against a certain group, but looking in the world somewhat differently in order not to invest more and more in terms of money and time and people, resources, in a war that may not be the war that we are fighting today or will fight tomorrow. One thing is very well known. In the old world of several thousand years, until some decades ago, it used to be states against states, kings against kings since biblical times. The whole idea of non-state actors, of organizations who fight states, is quite new. The only time I can think of in history where it worked was about, I would say, 4 decades ago. You may remember, those of you who are old enough like me, when there was an organization that fought a state but failed. The organization was called Spectra, and they failed because James Bond was smart enough to fight them. But this was what we are seeing today, an organization fighting the state. How do you do that if you don't have Sean Connery that young? It is a problem that we are coping with today. Today he's not called Blufeld or whatever the name was. He's called bin Laden or some other names. But the problem is of the same kind. Also the exact boundaries between states and non-states are somewhat blurred. Not only because of states harboring terrorism, helping them, providing them with intelligence, providing them with weapons, as we see with Hezbollah or Hamas or other Taliban or other powers, but because you have another form of an area that is officially ruled by a state, but in effect ruled by an organization that is acting almost like an army. Think of the territory of Lebanon and Hezbollah there. Who is the sovereign? Whom are you going to attack in order to stop a war? Is it the Lebanese government, the Lebanese army? Or is it an army or a group called Hezbollah that takes their orders from within and from Syria and from Iran? Who are you fighting? The idea of having an unclear situation like this, not a state, not a simple terror group, calls for a new thinking. Maybe if you damaged Lebanon more and more, it doesn't really do much to Iran that tells Hezbollah, go on, continue. How do you end a war like this? How do you finish it? Let me speak of another paradigm that I think maybe goes a little deeper, and it's somewhat sensitive politically to speak of, but let me speak of it anyway. There is a trend in some parts of the world, including large parts of the Muslim world, but not only there, that there is a decline in the identity of people by the nationhood and a rise of the identity of people as a religion. In polls that were conducted in some parts of the Muslim world, people identify them now more as Muslims than as Arabs, compared to what they used to do years ago. The first identity becomes religion to many people. Think of the following results. An Arab by nationality and a Lebanese by a particular nationality called Mr. Nasrallah takes orders, or is the closest ally of a non-Arab, non-Lebanese, Persian called Khamenei, and they act together against other Arabs. Why? because they both are Muslim Shiites. And this comes first, before being Lebanese or being Arab or being Persian, Iranian. You see alliances that have less to do with the paradigm of nations and more with the paradigm of religion. Think of the groups that we have seen developing in recent years, like Taliban on one hand, and Hezbollah and Hamas and Jihad and Al-Qaeda. All are religiously based, not all particularly nationally based. Some of them have interrelationship, and they act not within certain boundaries in many cases. The introduction of religion into decision-making, into thinking, into identity, not culturally, not family life, but in decision-making in politics, in using arms for religion, we enter a different phase. Europe has gone through religious wars many centuries. They paid heavily in blood, and they don't go back to religion. You don't see it in Europe. I don't want to speak about another nation over the Atlantic where evangelists are becoming very important, but in some parts of the world, you see this religion becoming the paradigm that rules people's lives and gives them inspiration and sends them to the battlefield more than in the past. And when this is connected with a terror group, with a group that's not a nation, this creates a new dimension to which we have to pay attention. Because when you fight in the name of God for religion, as most of these groups do, first of all, you are ready to sacrifice much more, because you do it in the name of God. Let me tell you, speaking of ourselves, we usually speak of the Muslims. There was one guy, a Jewish guy, not stupid, fundamentalist, who believes that his religion, the way he understands it, forces him to stop a certain government policy, and he killed our Prime Minister. His name was Yigal Amir. He killed Yitzhak Rabin in 1995, not far from here. Because if it's God's word, what should I do in God's name? When you introduce to normal, so to speak, normal conflicts that are between nations and can be resolved by politicians about boundaries, about other interests, you introduce religion, you exclude compromises. Gods, you know, when they enter the scene, never compromise. Gods are truth, whether they're Jewish gods or Christians or Muslims or whoever. When it's a God thing, you hear in the Israeli-Arab conflict a new element from Iran, Hezbollah and Hamas, not on national basis. They say it's religiously wrong. It's not permitted by religion to have a non-Muslim state in this area. If it's religion, what can you do? This goes hand in hand with the decline or the weakening of the powers of states. People have more power, states sometimes have less, as indicated very interestingly by the previous book of Tom Friedman of the New York Times on globalization, what he called the super-empowered individual. The individual can do almost anything in terms of economy, in terms of technology, in terms of good and bad things, is a new feature that we need to cope with, and it has a lot to do with the capabilities of terror groups that we see around us. How do you fight a war with such a group? If not always you know where the headquarters is, if it's not limited to one territory, if the balance of economic power doesn't mean much. No, people say the Soviet Union collapsed because they could not economically cope with America in building power. And the Russians, the Soviets have built a very significant Red Army for decades, and they couldn't kill one American soldier, and they collapsed. In steps Al-Qaeda, spending several $1 million and caused damage to America that America never saw. Because it doesn't matter anymore if you have a lot of money or less money. It doesn't cost much to wage this kind of war. And of course, what is the hierarchy, the chain of command in this net or network of organizations that we see developing using what we call terror, and they would call it other names, but this is what we see. In a way, to take it to a different, from a different angle, as I said earlier, it's the victory of what one can call the Western ideas of liberties, freedoms, democracy, and our pretension, I think rightly so, to impose it on everybody. To tell people in Afghanistan, you can't tell women not to study. You can't torture people. There are certain basic rights that are above you. So if we do that, and we do that by international law, by other ways, through the television and the internet, that find themselves in every tent, in every small village, it is seen by them as an attack on their civilization, on their way of life. And this may be one of the reasons for fighting back, using the technology that was invented by the modern world to fight this very world itself. In the world of technology and globalization today, individuals really are much more powerful and more important because they know everything, they see everything, and you have to satisfy them. So the fight that we see developing between the values that we thought were winning and between those who want to maintain different values cannot and are not fought in a battlefield between tanks divisions and tank divisions. They are fought in that sphere that we call terror. People who want sometimes to maintain their own way of life, which we think is abhorrent because it doesn't give any respect to human rights. They want to lead their lives without our intervention, and we tell them no. And some of them have ideologies that, of course, want to span all over the world. We see this developing as well. Let me touch, as the last point, something that has been very relevant in this country and in this area, and may be relevant again if a new war breaks out. In this interface between a state and an organization that we see, say, with Hamas and Hezbollah, our enemies developed a new paradigm of war to which we don't have a good answer. Good in the sense that the victory is very clear in the end of it. It consists of three major elements. One, the use of tens of thousands of rockets and missiles. These rockets and missiles don't know borders. They are not stopped by borders. In Lebanon now, in the hands of Hezbollah, there are about 44,000 or more rockets and missiles. 44,000 aimed at our country, covering every inch of this country, most of them just the northern part, some of them all over the country. In the hands of Hamas and other organizations in the Gaza Strip, which we have, left altogether for them to build a new life. What we have now is around 5,000 rockets, about 4,000 in the hands of Hamas, and about 1,000 in the hands of others. Some of them reaching just the neighborhood around them, in which many Israelis live, some of them reaching even the outskirts of this city. This is element number one, a lot of rockets. Before I go to number two, let me say, because it worked for them, they will have more rockets and missiles. Second, they will be with better warheads. Thirdly, they will have longer range. Fourthly, most importantly, they will be more accurate, which has a different value altogether in terms of damage that may be caused. Element number two, on top of rockets, is that it's all done from within civilian populations, against civilian populations. These launchers and rockets are deployed, even now, in most cases, within civilian population, amidst people, women, men, children, in schools, on rooftops, and cellars in area that is full with civilians. Thirdly, when a war breaks out, like it did in 2006 in Lebanon or in 2009 in Gaza, in no time you see a barrage of rockets rocketed by civilians. And this is the number 3 element. You don't see soldiers. You don't see soldiers with weapons, with uniformed. You see people like you and me running from house to house or hiding in a place or going to their orchard where they hit something, pulling a handle or pushing a button. And this is what you see now. You see, take a small example that was quite minimal, civilians in Khan Yunis launching rockets at civilians in Sderot, several kilometers away. The army is not in the loop. There's no army here. Civilians hitting civilians. If you take it to a larger scale, think of what it does to us or to any country under this threat. Now, there are different questions here. I will not give answers to them, not that I have them, but even if I had some of them, I don't have enough time to speak on them now. But I want to leave it for thinking. You need a military way, an operational way to deal with it. What do you do? Just defend yourself by building defense systems, very, very costly? Whom do you defend? Only your military power, your bases, your civilians, your strategic points? How much money are you going to spend on defense? Are you going to attack? Where? How? Who? There's no headquarters. It's not a regular army. What do you do with that? So the first thing is the military response. What is the end game? How do you want to end this game that it is made clear that they lost the war? What sort of intelligence do you need for that? Is it the leadership that you need to catch or to kill? If it's the terror group, you don't do it to a state, but to a terror group, is it right? Is it possible? The second question, not the military one, is the moral one. A launcher stands there, launching rockets at me. Every 10 minutes, every half an hour, a rocket. The launcher is within a kindergarten, many children. The only way to silence it is to launch a rocket or a bomb accurately aimed at that point. Am I allowed to do that? Once, twice? How many children am I allowed to kill in order to stop the killing of my children? It's all within civilian areas. I think the moral question is relevant, but the answer is clear. I'm not supposed to be a sitting duck. Third problem that we have been faced with when we read the Goldstone report on the last war that we had in Gaza. I don't want to speak on that report, but I didn't read all hundreds of pages, but some of it I read. And I was quite surprised not to read almost anything about this new dilemma. What are you about to do legally? Is it a war crime to attack the launchers, even if it's within civilian population? Is it not proportional? That is the term usually used today. What is proportionality here? Should I say that the laws of war do not apply? I don't think so. I think we need laws of war. I think we need to keep the rules of war. It's not something that should be easily changed. But is the interpretation of the rules of war well adapted to this new paradigm of conflict? It's not an easy question, but it's a very relevant one. Let me tell you that for a country like, say, the United States or Russia or other nations, whatever they do, no general and no soldier will ever be brought to The Hague. I can't say it on small nations. And you need to protect your soldiers. So what do you do in the realm of the rules of war, international law, humanitarian law? How do you fight war in this new paradigm of a changing world where terror groups that are half terror group, half state, something in between, fight you, and they think it succeeded, and they do continue. While we are speaking, to arm to pile up arms, and to get more intelligence and to prepare for the new conflict. I want to leave this at that and go back to what I said first. In the end of the day, when a war is fought, one needs to do it the best way you can and succeed. But in order to do that, before going to the training camps and developing a certain weapon or a certain intelligence method, you need to think. And you especially need to think when the world is changing. And what I wanted to indicate here and to give you some illustrations too is that the paradigm of war, of conflict, is radically changing when it comes to terror groups. It's something we didn't know in the past. And we need to think of ways to win the war against them. Thank you.